Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Well, we are opening. It's a pleasure and an honor to chair this morning's session here at the Hera Hall. We have three speakers, distinguished speakers this morning, and we are breaking the normal rules because Dr. Poulsen needs to rush to the airport shortly after his presentation. So because of that, we will take, he requested and I of course accepted, we will take questions and answers for his paper immediately after his presentation. We are basically following the rule of 20 minutes per speaker, but we can be a little bit more relaxed about it. I mean, after all, we're okay, and but we'll try. And in any case, I will inform. I can say at least 25 minutes if necessary, and if a minute more or there doesn't matter. After the first speaker, as I said, after Dr. Poulsen, we will have questions and answers for him, and then we will wish him bon voyage when he departs, and we will continue with the two other speakers, and who will present one after the other, and then we'll have the session of questions and answers afterwards. Okay, so we'll start. Dr. Niels Bo Poulsen is a military historian who specializes in the 19th and 20th century European military history. He's a leading expert on World War I and II, with special interest in Russian affairs and history. He is a teacher, a supervisor of thesis, and has a lot of experience. He has been teaching in many places. He is a regular commentator in the Danish media about Russian affairs. He authored a wide variety of books and articles, including some bestsellers, and he is more and more involved in recent years in Danish military history. And I must confess that I have great admiration to Denmark, because like my country Israel, it's a small country, very brave, surrounded by enemies, but with a glowing record of heroism and great military history. I'm sure we are all very enthusiastic to hear your presentation. Dr. Poulsen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Once again, thank you very much for the words, and my apologies for having to rush away from this canon, but thank you all for your flexibility on that matter. It is tremendously good, I would begin by declaring, to be here again after 1.5 years of lockdown, and I've really been looking forward to see colleagues and to have debates as we have had the last couple of days. But in order to get to the point, I would like to take you to a war of independence, which is probably not too well known outside Northern Europe, outside Scandinavia. The first of two successive wars between Denmark on the one hand, the Kingdom of Denmark on the one hand, and on the other hand, various German countries over the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein. On the Schleswig-Holsteinian side, this was seen as a war of independence, as they wanted an independent duchy, and eventually also wanted unification of Germany. On the Danish side, as you can see from this painting, showing the Danish soldiers in the sun and the insurgents in the shade, on the Danish side, this was seen as an uprising which needed to be crushed. Now we spoke about the heroic Danish military history. If we count this war as a success, it was a success in as much as Denmark eventually prevailed and preserved the two duchies. It was probably the last one, the last war Denmark won. After that, we lost all our wars, including, unfortunately, recently, our participation in the intervention in Afghanistan. The last couple of years, I have been studying the relationship between history, historiography, and military lesson learning processes. I am employed in an institution of military education, and my military colleagues and my students expect me somehow to assist them in how to draw lessons from the past. However, as we all know, drawing lessons from the past is no simple thing. And during my work, I've become increasingly interested in how military professionals actually study wars in order to draw lessons from them. Because, as I mentioned, it is a very contested matter, I think, whether we can actually learn from the past. The question relates to profound problems associated with what is history, whether historical events can be studied in a way that makes it possible to draw lessons from them. And on the one hand, we find the position that historical events are unique and can only be explained by great attention to context and to the interplay of numerous factors at various levels. This is a position which hardly invites into generating hard lessons from history. Additionally, when we look back and study history, we of course always does it from a contemporary perspective. The research questions we ask, the way we organize, read, interpret, and construct our narratives is all based on where we stand now as individuals as well as societies. In that sense, there are no eternal lessons to be learned from a given military campaign. There's only historiography. As we know, some scholars would even go so far as to claim that history writing resembles literature much more than it resembles any sort of science. On the other hand, despite these theoretical observations, history is perpetually being used by mankind, including the armed forces. It is a basic condition of our life that we extract lessons from the past. We do it as individuals, we do it as groups, we do it as nations. We use history to create and maintain identities, we use it to evaluate and judge past, present and future events, and we also use it as a guide to action. And military history has indeed been used consistently as a guide for action. Most military theory, for example, is inductive and bases itself on military experience. Military thinkers and others who have formulated principles of war have more often than not based their claims on history. But as mentioned, I have a little bit uneasy relationship to how to draw lessons from the past, and currently I'm writing a book about how armed forces relate to history, and I'm also carrying out, as part of that book, small case studies where I look at different campaigns, at different wars, and looks at how military practitioners over time have tried to sift lessons from these wars. And today we are talking about the 1848-1850 war. In an earlier paper presented in another conference, I had done a similar exercise about the 1864 war, the subsequent war. And before presenting you some of my observations, I would like briefly to take you through the history of this war in order to give you a little bit of better understanding of what this war was about. It began in March 1848 as part of the general revolutions which swept over Europe in 1848. At that time, on the one hand, you had in Denmark the king giving way for a constitution. On the other hand, in Schleswig-Holstein, the German-speaking upper class was fearful that this new Danish constitutional process that would lead to the full inclusion occlusion of the two duchies into Denmark proper. Until then, they had substantial home rule as they were duchies under the Danish king and not integral parts of Denmark. So an insurrection takes place, and the German Federation backs insurgents, sending volunteers, sending officers to the insurgent army, which quite rapidly gets in possession of all of Holstein, the southernmost of the two duchies, and eventually also moves north into Schleswig. Then we see a prolonged period between April 1848 and October 1850, where periods of war are intertwined with mediation efforts and ceasefires. The two principal powers attempting to stop the war are Great Britain and Russia. Both powers essentially want a fairly strong independent Denmark, as Denmark controls the access to the Baltic Sea. Then, in the last part of the war, on 25th July 1850, you have what is the biggest battle of the war, the Battle of Isted, which you can see more or less in the middle of the purple area. Actually, the biggest battle ever fought on Danish soil. Like many other battles in the war, this, on the one hand, is a Danish victory, but it is also a modest victory, and it results essentially in the realization on both sides that the war cannot be won by military means. After that, fighting more or less dies out, and in 1852, by the so-called London Protocol, status quo is re-established, and you now have essentially the overall control of the two duchies going back to the government in Copenhagen. That ends in 1864, when a new war is declared by Prussia and Austria against Denmark for various reasons which are not relevant right now, and then eventually Denmark loses Holstein and Schleswig. But that is another story, of course. But I find it relevant to mention the Second War, because when we look at the lesson making of the First War, we should be aware of the Second War. A few words about the sources I've been consulting for this study, and also a few words about the war's place in Danish historiography. I have used the numerous books and periodical articles written by military officers about the war. There were at that time two different army monthly periodicals, and there was also a Navy monthly periodical. These have been consulted for all the time from the 1850s until today. And then, of course, I've also, as mentioned, used the considerable number of books written by military officers. And as you can see on my figure, if it's possible to see it in the background, this figure depicts the number of Danish non-fiction books on the different wars Denmark has been fighting since 1801 and onwards. And as you may see, we have here in the middle, now I'll shout as I move away from the microphone, here in the middle we have World War II, which is by far the most studied of all wars Denmark has been participating in. But second comes the Second War over Schleswig, the 1864 war, and then on the third place comes the war I'm currently talking about. With quite a significant number of written publications alone in terms of books. You have about 3,500 books on that war. But in contrast to the 1864 war, very few of the books and other written products about the war are actually offering lessons. Most books, I should first say, most books are actually not about military history as such. They are about the political history of the war, or they are about the cultural and social impact of the war, or about German-Danish relations in general, and so on and so on. So if we narrow it down, it comes down to say a couple of hundred books, and then additionally something like 50 articles or so written in military terms about this war, the 48-50 war. And we have to narrow it even more down if we just want to find texts which are addressing possible lessons. Because even though it's a well-studied subject, the war, in contrast to the 1864 war, there are, however, curiously few works studying the lessons of that war. I shall return in a moment to the explanation for this puzzling fact. But before addressing, as I mentioned, why so few lessons have been drawn from this war, I will just highlight some of the main lessons being drawn. No, sorry, I will actually start, I realize now, by addressing the fact that so few articles are addressing the lessons. And probably the best explanation for the discrepancy between the numerous texts addressing lessons of the 1864 war and the relatively few texts addressing lessons of the 1848 war. The possible explanation is first and foremost Denmark, or at least the Danish population, believed to have won the 1848-50 war. A surge of patriotism swept the country, and also the armed forces were fairly happy about their performance in that war. And whenever you are winning a war, you do not, quite often at least, you do not contemplate that much about why did you go as it went. Essentially, the Danish armed forces felt that the doctrine had been endorsed by the war because it was won. Then, if we move up in time a little bit, we have a new war, only some 14 years later, which is a disaster for Denmark. So that war becomes far more important to the Danish population in general, but also to the officers, because it is a disastrous war, it's a lost war, and it has a tremendous impact because it's approximately 1/3 of the entire Danish territory, which is lost in 1864. And finally, of course, also the 1848-1850 war is fought really in a classical Napoleonic war way, whereas the 1864 war in many terms is a modern war, where you have telegraph, you have railroads, you have everything you also associate with the big German wars in 1870 and 1866. So this is probably also where much more lesson making have been done in terms of the latter war. Nevertheless, some lessons have been deducted. A number of authors have criticized the Danish government for not being well prepared, not having strong alliances, and also not naively believing that in the international world after the Napoleonic Wars had become a peaceful world, a world where no major war would take place. And as you can see from my quote here, as one example, these kinds of observations are, of course, as I argued earlier on, often linked to what happens in your present. In this case, an author is commenting on the dialogue between the foreign minister and the heads of the services, and he's writing in 1948 at a time when Denmark was just about to enter NATO. And he argues in his text that the lesson of the 1848-50 war is that you need to be a member of a strong alliance, but you also need very close alignment between the foreign policy and the security politics. And as you can see from the quote, he is also arguing that the problems you encountered in 1848-50 are the same problems as you encountered in 1940. So really taking the lessons up to his own time. Then, apart from preparing for the war and the political military dialogue, which I've just alluded to, also a number of observers have used this war to argue that Denmark's armed forces needed a strong navy in order to secure mobility, in order to protect the inner lines of Denmark, as we are having numerous islands, and of course also the lesson then of this war, where Denmark carried out several successful amphibious operations, moving its army from one place to another. So the argument here is that by having a strong navy, Denmark could prevail in war by doing flank attacks. Then some have also studied the role of personalities. Curiously enough, that these studies, they have been backward reading some of the principles of war of the Danish armed forces of the 1970s and 1980s to the 1848 war. Very much in a similar vein as the famous Delbruck Strategiestrid, the Danish military commentators in the 1980s simply applied their own understanding of logics and military operations on the 1848 war. The most recent study of this war have simply given up to carry out a big lesson-making process. It's written by a young, talented officer who wrote a 100-page long expose about the Battle of Isted recently. And he eventually just resorted to saying what we can learn from this war is the ever-present role of friction. This is the only lesson we can draw, that when you make plans and execute military operations, things go wrong. That is hard to disagree with. And I think that represents somehow also the fact that contemporary armed forces in Denmark are a little bit more shy than they were, say, 50 years ago or 100 years ago, of presenting hard lessons of war. And now, for my conclusion, I would argue that the findings I have done corresponds to Jespersen 1977, that you need to read Danish in order to understand, or for that matter read German, because then you can also read Danish if you try hard. But Jespersen in 1977 carried out a study of the Lutter and Barenberg battle, and argued that much of the military lesson making from that war was distorted heavily by the desire of later days officers to generate funding and so on. And Julio Echevarria in 1997, in a very well-written article about the German military history in the 19th century, also argues, as you can see in my quote below, that much of the work done by the German military historians from the armed forces, they were characterized by a romantic, heroic narrative and centered on an intuitive understanding and vicarious understanding of the past. And I would argue this is also what takes place in much of the works that I have studied, meaning that the lessons of the 1848-50 war essentially reflects as much the position of the Weiser himself in his own time as they represent what actually happened in that war. And I guess I'm here stating the obvious to a certain extent, but nevertheless I think we as professional historians need to engage with our armed forces about these problems of lesson making. That is, if you don't have a strong historiographic take on a given war, then it is very hard really to see what are possible eternal lessons of that war and what are simply backward reading of today's problems and challenges. And by that, I end my presentation. Once again, I'm sorry for rushing out in a couple of minutes, but thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Poulsen, for an introduction to a relatively little-known conflict. And as I said before, we are breaking the normal rules to take questions and answers from the floor now, because of the reality that. Unfortunate reality that we are losing Dr. Poulsen shortly because he needs to rush to the airport and go back home. So if there are any questions, yes, please.
Yes, my name is Gerard Verks from the Netherlands. I was wondering whether there were any diplomatic efforts by the Danish to get support from other countries. You mentioned the German Federation supported the Dutchies. So that's one question. Small second question, what was the role of the head of state in this lack of communication between the foreign and the defense minister?
As to your first question, initially Denmark was very much hoping for intervention from Great Britain and Russia. For many reasons, including of course that being an absolutist multinational Empire Russia itself was not very fond of seeing the principle of national self-determination being growing in force. As it became impossible to Denmark for a number of reasons to really mobilize Great Britain and Russia as partners in the war, they merely acted as mediators, but they also put significant pressure, it should be added, on the German Federation, including forcing the German Federation to withdraw most of its troops. Then eventually Denmark hoped then for intervention from Sweden, which were traditionally our enemies, but from about the Napoleonic Wars, it had gradually changed in a more positive direction. And Sweden and Norway, what at that time was part of Sweden, sent actually a number of volunteers, but also never really stepped into the war on the Danish side. As for your second question, the Danish king of that time, Frederik VII, was actually not very interested in being a king. He had other interests, including archaeological excavations and fishing. So he happily endorsed the possibility of giving away most of his powers by installing a government which eventually became a democratic government. So he interfered quite little in the war, actually. And he was he did occasionally, but not to such an extent that it really either improved or, on the other hand, hampered the war effort. He was kind of a neutral figure, if I may put it like that.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Remove your mask, it'll be easier to understand you.
Yes, sorry.
No problem, pleasure.
But I want to know if you have some, can give us some details about the social impact in this war. For example, how many persons did it? The humanity also humanity lessons can deduct in this war, especially in the Danish army.
Yes. Thank you for that question. Even though this war was a mixture between, seen from the Danish perspective, causing a rebellion and also to a certain extent a civil war between different parts of Denmark, and in this mixed area of Schleswig-Holstein, you would have a lot of intermarriage and fluid identities. People would be speaking German and still feel Danish, or they would be speaking Danish or feel like Germans and so on. Even though it was quite a complicated conflict with all the resemblances of a civil war, it actually, from a humanitarian perspective, was quite a gentle war. You had hardly any kind of atrocities carried out by the two sides. The civilian population was generally treated quite nicely, and there were very low number of civilian casualties also from collateral damage, as most of the battles took place in the open field. So the number of direct civilian casualties were very limited. We are speaking about a few hundred people or something like that, whereas the military casualties went up to the thousands. It was also, but it had a very definite impact, nevertheless, the war, because this war really generated a much stronger feeling of being Danish or being German. Until then, as I mentioned, identities not only in the border region but also in Denmark in general had been relatively fluid, and most of our customs are actually Germans with a little bit of a Scandinavian twist. But this war really began to galvanize Danish nationalism. It created the idea of distinct Danish identity, different from Germanness, quite often in opposition to Germanness. If I may for a second take this all the way up to the Second World War, it has been argued by several Danish scholars that probably the biggest reason why Denmark was rescuing its Jewish population, apart from the fact that it was quite easy to do it, as you had neutral Sweden just across Copenhagen. The biggest reason was that since anti-Semitism in Denmark was associated heavily with Germany, and since Danish national identity from 1848 and onwards became almost defined by everything which Germany is, we should be the opposite. Then, and I'm not saying that Danes were not necessarily not anti-Semitic, but it would be kind of bad taste to declare that we were anti-Semitic. And that probably also helps explain why you had a different situation in Denmark in World War II. So this war, in that sense, actually has some very long shadows.
Thank you very much, very interesting, and thank you for the question and for the answer. And the final, I take the liberty to, before you depart, final quick question. Holstein, of course, and that connects to your interest in Russia. Holstein, of course, was the place where, from which the Tsar Peter III comes from. Can you very briefly speak about what happened with Holstein from the time he arrived to Russia to become the Tsar after Elizabeth in 1762, 61, 62, depending upon the dates of the Julian versus the Gregorian, and 1848?
Well, essentially, to put it briefly, Holstein was, and I have to take your question to another place first. Holstein was originally a part of the German Empire, and the Danish king was only ruling in Holstein, when we go back to the Middle Ages, as a duke, a German duke under the German emperor. So, and Schleswig, on the other hand, was also a duchy, but it was a duchy directly under the Danish king outside the German Empire. So on the one hand, you have this situation that the Danish king is duke in Holstein. On the other hand, due to a number of complicated legal developments and dynastic developments during the early modern time period, as was mentioned here, eventually a strong Duke of Gottorp emerges, who actually co-rules together with the king. It became really complicated in constitutional terms. So you have actually in Holstein, you have areas where the Danish king and the Duke of Gottorp rules jointly. You have also small enclaves where the Danish king is sovereign over the Duke of Holstein is sovereign. And it became Denmark's main security problem in the 18th century to do away with this annoying Duke, who unfortunately then is associated with the Russian Tsarist family. And eventually, with the event of the peace after the Napoleonic Wars, you are able to restore full, so to speak, Danish sovereignty over this territory.
Thank you very much, Dr. Poulsen. We wish you all bon voyage, and looking forward to seeing you in the next congresses.
Absolutely.
All the best to you. Thank you very much. We are continuing with the theme of David versus Goliath, although it was great to hear that David won in the last conflict, but again we have a representative of a small and brave nation, and it's a pleasure and an honor to introduce my good friend Lasse, Professor Lasse Laaksonen from Finland. He is a professor of Finnish and Scandinavian history in the University of Helsinki. He works also with the National Defense University, and he teaches military history in the University of Eastern Finland. He is a great expert on Mannerheim, the great personality of Finnish history, military history, political history in the previous century, and he worked a lot in all the spheres dealing with Finnish military history, the Winter War, the War of Continuation, World War II, and I know also from our long friendship how much he goes into all the aspects and nuances of Finnish history. His most famous book is Discord and Authority, the personal relationship of Mannerheim and his generals and their effect on leadership. And if I would go through all his credentials, it it won't leave us time to hear his presentation. But I can say he is a really leading scholar, and for us it's, as I said, a pleasure and an honor to hear your presentation this morning. Lasse, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Aaron.
Good luck.
Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues. At first, I have 4 important questions in my presentation, to which I will give answers. What is the anatomy of the battlefield in the Finnish Lapland like? In what ways was the civil war fought in the northern part of Finland? What was the significance of the northern region of Finland in the international context? And the last one, how the early experiences subsequently utilized against the Red Army in the Winter War. So let's start. Finland declared independence during the First World War on December 6, 1917. This historical event was possible partly because of Russia had 2 revolutions during the year 1917 and Russian Empire collapsed. The Bolshevik retained, approved the independence of the former Grand Duchy on the last day of the year 1917. Most European countries recognized the Republic of Finland in the year 1918. Situation in Finland was tense. The food shortage and strikes escalated internal situation in the country. Both the bourgeois and socialists has their own guards or militia. The October Revolution was an example for the Finnish socialists. Lenin promised them armed support. In Finland, civil war broke out at the end of January. The Reds, who fought against the legitimate government, quickly take over the southern Finland main industrial cities, including the capital city Helsinki. The Senate escaped to Ostrobothnia, which the Whites took to their support area and where the commander-in-chief of White Army also established his headquarters. The political and military leadership of the Reds organized in Helsinki. However, the greatest military force in Finland was the Russians, who had not left the country. The strategic battles of the Finnish Civil War were fought over the dominance of the cities and railway connections of the southern Finland. The Jägers, who gained their military training in Germany and fought of the Eastern Front bring their military experience for the whites. They act not only as military leaders, but also as military instructions. This was an advance to the Finns because both of the red and white forces were poorly trained. Basically, troops were quickly assembled amateurs. The red were little supported by the Russians, who remained passive. The commander-in-chief of the White Army, General Mannerheim, and his generals had their former careers in the Russian Empire Army, and the Bolsheviks were their enemies. Relations between Mannerheim and Sherman were tense. There were also poor atmosphere between the Finnish Jägers and Mannerheim. However, the Senate was responsible for the political decisions. The commander-in-chief was only a military leader. With support of Germany, the victory of the Civil War became easier when the Baltic Division, commanded by General von der Goltz, landed on the south coast of Finland and advanced to Helsinki. Finnish Lapland and the Northern Front were only a sideshow. It was on the map of the white headwaters, but almost only existed when the focus was in the north, was the Battle of Tornio. Tornio town had a strategic importance because it was on the border between Finland and Sweden. After the city of Tornio had been conquered from the Russians and the Finnish Red Guards, the white headquarters focused to the great offensive on the southern Finland. Captain Kurt-Martti Wallenius, who had gained his military training in the Jäger Battalion 27th in Germany, was appointed as commander of the White Army in the Lapland. Under Wallenius was nearly 1,000 men in an area almost the size of Belgium. The front against Russia was approximately the same as the First World War's Western Front. Troops under Wallenius were poorly trained. Basically, they lacked military training. Troops were very poorly armed if they had a rifle at all. The Reds suffered from the same problems. Although the rebels have been driven from cities and towns, they had not given up resistance. The Red fled to the Russian side. The Finnish Reds received help from Bolsheviks. Soviet troops drove Russian white forces to the north. The situation was confusing. There were no solid fronts in the wilderness. This was also the case of Vienna, Karelia, White Sea Karelia. Wallenius saw the direction of Vienna from a military point of view. He had no interest of uniting Finnish-speaking people, the Karelians. For Wallenius, the battle against the Red was the primary goal. He wanted to protect Finland from the threat of Bolsheviks. Mannerheim, the commander-in-chief of White Army, was not enthusiastic about the attack by the young Jäger captain Wallenius. From headquarters of Mannerheim, Wallenius returned almost empty-handed. he was promised only a small number of conscripts. The result of the troop recruiting was much less than expected. Wallenius had managed his task and expedition with 1,000 soldiers. Troops were poorly equipped, poorly conditions accumulated by the spread of disease, no medicine were available. The White Army headquarters was not convinced of the warfare on unknown territory in the wilderness. The generals who served in the cavalry did not have knowledge of the terrain of Lapland. Basically, their information was like from fairy tales. In their view, the Arctic wilderness could only be fought. A minor battle maintenance was difficult to arrange, and long distances made it possible to fight only for a few dozen men. The Finnish Jaeger officers did not have time to train their inexperienced forces in the north. When the first battle of the border villages took place, the men were unpredictable in their maneuvers. It was difficult for the officers to keep the order. Wallenius compared the first combat experiences to the encounter of two frightened rapids, which both ran away, both to different directions. The white and reds were not even separated except from the armbands. The men were in their own civilian clothes. By the end of the Civil War, troops of Wallenius had not been able to reach northern Vienna, and the Reds had not succeeded in invading northern Finland. However, the victory of the White Army and the return of legitimate government to Helsinki did not calm the situation in Lapland. Finland was at war with Soviet Russia, and the border had not yet been conferred. After the Bolsheviks had made peace with Germany in March of 1918 in Brest-Litovsk, Britain became more active in the source of the Arctic Ocean and the North Russia. The warfare in the north was foreign to the British. They recruited locals with their troops. The main task and goal was the control of Murmansk Railway and the Arctic seaports. The British tried to save their own supplies from the hands of Bolsheviks. In the summer 1918, many red Finns who had fled Finland instituted to serve His British Majesty. The Murmansk legion was well equipped, and the strength was over 1,000 men. The recruits were trained and they had decent weapons and a salary. After the Civil War, there were German troops in Finland. The Germans organized Finnish general staff. The Germans also visited in the northern Finland and explored the Arctic terrain. General von der Goltz met Wallenius in summer of 1918. When the border soldiers of Wallenius stood in their line like shabby drums, the General von der Goltz turned jacket of one man. This border soldier did not even have an undershirt. German general have turned his back and tightened his nose. The border between Finland and Russia was restless. In the fall of 1918, tried to calm the situation on the border. In Lapland, the problems were not caused only by Russians and the Finnish Reds, but also various villains and robbers. The native people stole each other's reindeer. Wallenius received order from the Ministry of Interior to gain control over the area, including the local Skolksami people. Wallenius did not only try to gain control, he also used and recruited the Finnish Sami. By this way, he learned from them to take advantage of terrain, ambush and move smoothly around the Arctic battlefield impresentable. In the middle of nowhere, in the wild east, law was read from the barrel of a rifle. After the end of the First World War, interest of the Finnish regime was more and more interested in Petsamo. It was gateway to the Arctic Ocean. Increasingly significantly, it had economic and maritime importance. However, despite the wide license of the Finns, the issue was not handled at the Paris peace negotiations. The Senate decided to safeguard the interest and property of Finland in Petsamo. There was a desire to avoid the use of military force. Only a company were sent to the area. The military expeditions were led by Wallenius. He had the best knowledge of the Arctic circumstances. Crossing the hills was difficult. Skis and reindeer were essential for survival. The importance of intelligence gathering was emphasized. The enemy was difficult to detect. The maintenance to manpower when Wallenius reached the source of the Petsamo feud, changes of troops of Wallenius holding their position for a long time were not existed. The Russian whites had already left, and it was only a matter of time when the Bolsheviks would attack. The Finns left Petsamo at the end of March 1920. On the same day, the Bolsheviks arrived in the field with 2 warships and landed to the shore. The ski units of the Bolsheviks managed to besiege the main force of Wallenius, who had to fight to get through the Finnish side. In severe weather conditions, men also got lost or disappeared. A part of troops of Wallenius were eventually found to the Norwegian side. The peace agreement of Tartu between Finland and Soviet Russia ended in the force at the end of 1920. In terms of borders, the biggest quest was in East Karelia. Lenin had promised to the Finnish Red East Karelia during the Civil War, but in the Peace of Tartu, area remained on the Russian side of border. Finland received Petsamo as a compensation. Wallenius was in the north, receiving the new territory in February 1921. The army of the Republic of Finland received its first lesson from the Arctic warfare in so-called border wars. The troops in the Lapland did not receive help from other fronts. Warfare is unpredictable, but in the Arctic climate it really was unpredictable. Not least because almost everything was new to the officers and for the untrained soldiers. The local people had know how to live in the harsh conditions. Wallenius has had contact with the local people. He learned from hunters and reindeer herders surviving in the wilderness. In the Arctic warfare, importance of surprise, intelligence, and the maintenance had their own high value when the Arctic battlefield created its own laws. About 20 years later, Wallenius used Arctic warfare in the larger scale in the Winter War. Under his command was the Lapland Group. Although war technology was more advanced and Russians had mechanized troops, the Finns were able to use the terrain and gain advantage. The Russians were stopped by the ships and maneuvers by small strike forces from different directions. During the Winter War, the troops of Major General Wallenius drew back the efforts of the Red Army to advance through the northern Finland to the border between Finland and Sweden. The movement of the Soviet troops were stopped in Salva, 100 kilometers on the Finnish side. The Russians had no manpower to continue the effort. The Finnish did not drive them out of the country. The front line remained until the end of the Winter War. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lasse. And we are, as I said before, we are continuing with our last speaker this morning, and we'll take the questions afterwards. Okay, the questions and answers later on. Okay, our last speaker this morning is Dr. Patrick Neffors. Neffors, I suppose? Neffors. Again, representing a small and brave country, discussing even a period before this country was even established. The period which is closer to my pursuits of the Napoleonic Wars. Dr. Patrick Neffors is a doctor of history, and he heads the documentation center of the Royal Military Museum in Brussels, a museum I had the great pleasure and honor of visiting many times, including during the 2015 the Napoleonic Congress there. He has published on industrial collaboration in 1940 to 44 and on Braindonk. Dr. Neffors, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. After Napoleon's first abdication on the 6th of April 1814, the great powers set out to redraw the map of Europe and decided to unite northern and southern Netherlands to create a bulwark against France. On the 1st of August 1814, the southern Netherlands, corresponding roughly to present-day Belgium, were confided to the governorship of Willem Frederik, sovereign Prince of Orange. After Napoleon's escape from Elba, he became, as Willem I, King of the United Netherlands in March 1815, and in May also became the ruler of the southern Netherlands east of the Meuse, until then under Prussian rule. Creating a new army had been an important task since his return to Holland on the 30th November of 1813, and it became even more urgent because of the renewed threat of Napoleon.
It will be easier, we will see better. Yeah, no problem. Yeah.
Sorry, no problem. Go ahead, sorry.
Moreover, the army now had to be amalgamated with the forces of the south, the small Belgian legion created at the behest of the Allied authorities. This new army of Dutchmen and Belgians underwent its baptism of fire at Waterloo. 15 years later, however, the Kingdom of the Netherlands and its army were split in two by the Belgian Revolution of 1830. One of the reproaches leveled against Willem was the underrepresentation of Belgian officers. This paper examines the formation of the army of the Kingdom of the Netherlands in 1814-1815, and in particular the role played by or assigned to the Belgians. To a large extent, it is a void in the historiography. Dutch studies, with some exceptions, an article by Jos Gabriels and a dissertation by Erik Zwart, pay scant attention to the Belgian side, and there is a striking dearth of recent publications by Belgian authors on this subject. This paper takes the long view and shows that the events of 1814-1815 cannot be understood without a study of the past, especially the divergent paths both countries and their military took in the years 1789 to 1814. It looks at how the Dutch decision makers set out about creating one army through an analysis of the commissioning of officers, the recruitment and organization of the army, and the conditions of service that had an impact on Dutch-Belgian relations, such as discipline and language. And finally, it looks at what effect this policy had on relations between Dutch and Belgians in the army. First of all, one has to understand the huge differences between North and South during the 20 years of French dominance or occupation. The South was annexed in 1795, but the North managed to survive as a vassal state, first the Batavian Republic, then the Kingdom of Holland of Louis Napoleon until 1810. Conscription would therefore be introduced in the South 15 years earlier than in the North. This meant that the Dutch kept their own army until 1810. Dutch soldiers and officers would thus mostly stay together in their own units throughout the entire French era, even after 1810, as well as keep a larger officer corps than the Belgians. The Belgians were more numerous than the Dutch. They would in general be scattered more widely over the French units, and there would be fewer Belgian officers. Many Belgian officers who served in the Austrian army before the French invasions stayed loyal to the House of Habsburg throughout the Napoleonic era. Of the different groups that would make up the officer corps of the Army of the United Netherlands, it would be anachronistic to see it as composed of only Dutchmen versus Belgians, when in fact there were different groups, French Belgians, so to say, and Austrian Belgians, Dutch oranges that had gone into exile during the French years, and Dutch officers with a French past, as well as active officers versus officers that came back from retirement. The different way and time in which North and South were liberated also had a profound impact on army development. On the one hand, the country that could at least claim to have liberated itself, with a sovereign prince who quickly set out to create an army and reintroduce conscription. On the other hand, the southern Netherlands, where the elites hadn't shown any initiative like that displayed by Van Hogendorp in Holland, ruled by the Allied, who led a tiny Belgian volunteer army, the Belgian Legion, whose short history was a sorry tale of incompetence and corruption. When Willem became Governor-General of Belgium on the 1st of August 1814, the administration of military affairs in the south was first confided to a committee, and then on the 1st of September to the Dutch Lieutenant General Jan Willem Janssens, a former Minister of War of Louis Napoleon, acting Commissioner General of War in the north since a month, and now became Commissioner General of War in the south as well. When Janssens was definitely appointed in the north in December, he was replaced in the south by Lieutenant General Tyndall until the abolishment of the department in the south on the 1st of July 1815. Janssens now had to reorganize and increase the small Belgian army in order to prepare it for its future fusion with the Dutch army. It had first of all to get rid of the incompetent officers of the Belgian Legion. As the study of all officers is of course an impossible undertaking, I opted for a case study of the colonels, titular and second colonels included, the latter being a short-lived new rank created in April 1815. There were 126 colonels between December 1813 and the end of 1815, of whom 19 were Belgian. With a small adaptation of the time frame used by Jos Gabriels in his study of the generals, I discerned 4 phases: December 1813 until July 1814, August 1814 until March 1815, March to September 1815, and October to December 1815. The first phase, of course, is before the Dutch took over the administration of Belgium, but it's important because it shows how different the starting positions would be. 44 of the 126 colonels of the Netherlands army were commissioned in this first phase. There was one Belgian amongst them, Fernand Douw from Bruges, who belonged to the small group of the so-called Batavian Belgians, Belgians with a Dutch army past. Douw served in the French army that invaded Holland in 1795, stayed there and joined the army of the Batavian Republican Kingdom of Holland and finally the French army. Colonel Douw was set back in rank upon arrival, but quickly became titular colonel in April. In the second phase, between the 1st of August 1814 and 1st of March 1815, the Belgians would make up almost a third of the new colonels, 12 out of 39. They were a mixed group consisting of 4 of the 9 colonels of the Belgian Legion Janssens didn't get rid of, 5 veterans of the French, and 3 of the Austrian army, the latter is a bit of a forgotten group. 2 officers of the Belgian Legion had also been in Austrian uniform in the last decade of the 18th century, whilst the other had no prior military experience. With one exception, these so-called Austrian Belgians had all been militarily inactive for between 8 and 22 years. In this respect, they were comparable to the Dutch Orangists. The French Belgians, on the contrary, were battle-hardened veterans with military experience of up to 20 years. Another important difference between the French veterans and the 9 others was their pedigree. The others were all born as noblemen. Not one Belgian, contrary to legend, was set back in rank, and many even got promoted. The Austrians more so than the French veterans. But at least the latter were not set back in rank. In the case of Duvivier, who had the most impressive career of them all, Janssens justified his choice to give this former colonel of the French 16th Hussars a colonel's pay rather than a lieutenant's colonel, with the argument that one had acted differently in Holland, but everything had to induce the Dutch to return immediately to their fatherland. The Dutch had had their own state for 2 centuries and only recently lived under foreign yoke, whereas Belgium had only been a province of a foreign power for centuries and united with France since 20 years, so that those individuals who served abroad had far greater merit if they abandoned everything to serve the cause of their country. Whereas Janssens' plea for Duvivier showed his foremost motivation was to create an army with capable officers. His generous and lenient treatment of the noblemen was politically motivated. Here he had to implement the king's policy of courting the great noblemen of the south. One incident involving a member of the grandest family of them all, Prince Ernst of Arenberg, proves it well. Presumably because Tindal had reprimanded him earlier for the lack of order and discipline amongst his troops, Arenberg angrily walked out of a dinner with the general, wrote first a letter asking for leave to Janssens, didn't await the answer, and wrote a second letter of resignation, and rushed from Ghent to The Hague to ask an audience with the king. The dispute finally ended with a whimper. Arenberg withdrew his resignation and got his leave. So Janssens had to navigate between the king's instructions to avoid unpleasantness with the great Belgian nobleman and the need to maintain military discipline. The third phase, from March to September 1815, were the months in which Napoleon fled Elbe, Willem became king of the Netherlands, and the Netherlands army fought at Waterloo and entered France with the Allied armies. The Belgians represented again a third of the colonels, 3 out of 9, only 1 of 14 second colonels. All Belgian and almost all Dutch colonels were veterans from the French army now. The Belgian second colonel had switched sides from Austria to France in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars. In view of the military threat from France, military imperatives now had precedence over political ones. The inexperienced survivors of the Belgian Legion, Colonels De Croix and Van der Burg, noblemen who had raised their own regiment, were now replaced as commanders of their cavalry regiments by experienced men like Duvivier and Temerx. And when in April 1815 4 Belgian colonels got promoted to Major General, they were all Napoleonic veterans. 3 of them also tellingly Batavian Belgians. Fourth phase, finally from the reforms of October 1815 until the end of the year, saw the army return to peacetime conditions. The proportion of Belgian colonels now dwindled to 10%, not 1 of the 4 colonels, and only 2 of the second or the 16th in rank were absolutely not founded, though of course only a study of all officers could disprove it entirely. There were of course also contemporary rumblings about discrimination and about bias against the Belgians in the personnel department, especially on the part of a Colonel von Römer of German origin, whose attitude annoyed even the King's Secretary of State, Anton Falk, a sincere believer in the Union. Why then were Belgian officers such a minority in the Netherlands army? Why did they join or not join? Captain von Hagen summed it up neatly in his memoirs. Because the Dutch were there first. The imbalance was already there after the first phase. After that, less Belgian officers returned from France to Dutchmen. First of all, because there were less of them to start with, and because they didn't return or hesitated longer to return. Nationalism, in the sense of not wanting to serve in the Dutch army, had nothing to do with it. But neither was it the obvious choice for them as it was for Dutch officers. With a liberated fatherland with its own monarch, the overwhelming majority of the Dutch could simply not imagine a career in France. Young Lieutenant Hevan Pictius might have regretted that the Emperor had not stayed on a bit longer as he was about to be promoted, and was instead reverted in rank on his return. But return he did. For Belgians, on the career considerations, family matters and regimental bonds would all play a role in their choice. The French royal decree of the 12th of May 1814 had reduced the number of French officers, and those put in non-activity had to live on half pay, the demi-solde. Days after, the Belgian Nicolas Daen received the French War Minister's letter that put him on half pay, he had French generals write letters of recommendation on his behalf to the highest-ranking Belgian general, Ehlers. Another demi-solde was Colonel Demy, who put out feelers to both camps. Dissatisfied with Tyndall's refusal to promise a promotion, he turned to the French War Ministry, which was no more forthcoming, and that settled the matter. Daen also joined the Netherlands army rather belatedly because he knew few Dutch generals. Daubermé, by contrast, got a letter by Tyndall asking him to join, a solidarity that went back to a common past in the garden of Louis Napoleon. He was also one of the Batavian Belgians who clearly still saw themselves as Belgians, but with a second fatherland. And for Janssens, they were the ideal man to employ in the south, and Daubermé would prove that a Belgian could reach the top as he became Belgium's longest-serving Commissioner General of War in the 1820s. Let us now look at the organizational changes and the lower ranks. There were fewer Belgian officers than Dutch, but there were also at first far fewer Belgian soldiers. In view of the many problems, recruitment, desertion and so on, fewer Belgian line regiments were planned than Dutch ones, even if Belgium was more populous than Holland. When one examines the provincial origins of the volunteers of the line regiments, one is struck by the fact that the Walloon departments of Oort and Saint-Rémeuse, partly occupied by the Prussians, contributed more than their share of the population, and that 3 Flemish-speaking departments were poorly represented among the officers. These findings show the absurdity of interpreting the events of 1815 through the prism of Belgium's later linguistic and regional divide. Walloons were certainly not averse to serving in a Belgian army that was about to be merged with its Dutch counterpart. When the Dutch finally introduced conscription in Belgium in April 1815, it went rather smoothly. Here and there former soldiers cried "Vive Napoleon," but there were also scenes of peasants going to the lottery town, I quote, drums beating, banner flying, and the orange cockade on their hats. Conscription would eventually lead to more Belgian militia regiments than Dutch ones, but at the time of Waterloo, there would only be Belgian line regiments in the field. On the 8th of October 1815, the army was reorganized in the so-called afdeling of 1 regular and 3 militia battalions. This entrenched the regional way the army was structured and recruited, and would have far-reaching consequences in 1830 when the common soldier simply went back home and the southern regiments melted away. Regarding conditions of service, I'll focus on 2 aspects that would also play a role in 1830. Dutch military regulations introduced corporal punishment, especially the so-called bastonnade, cane, which became a symbol of Dutch oppression in 1830. In reality, its application was limited to soldiers incorrigible by other means. Renowned Belgian jurist Gerard saw its abolition in 1830 as more rhetorical than practical. The language question was not so important in 1814-1815. Dutch officially became the language of training and command in a country where French was spoken in Wallonia, but also by the elites in the Flemish provinces, but this policy was leniently and pragmatically applied. The decree added explicitly that all writings would also be done in French. Lack of knowledge of the Dutch language was no obstacle to becoming an officer, and Janssens or Tyndall wrote in French to Belgian officers. After all, they had all been together in the armies under Napoleon. Janssens would consider an officer not suited for Belgium because of his scant knowledge of French. Count Etienne Gondy, in charge of police in the southern departments, claimed the use of Dutch was a problem for Flemish-speaking men and little desertion, but according to military historian Louis de Vos, French was often used in units in Wallonia. Regarding military education, Belgians will always be a tiny minority at the military academy, so we can assume that the linguistic factor reduced many French-speaking Belgians' enthusiasm for an army career. There was also still the old system of the officer cadets in units, and correspondence shows they did not need to know Dutch beforehand but had to learn the commands afterwards. The union of the northern and southern Netherlands had to be the perfect amalgam. Was this the case in the army? How were the relations between Dutch and Belgians? This is not a question that can be answered easily, as there is hardly an abundance of sources. According to Ilken, who studied the letters of soldiers from the Liège region in the French army, the change of allegiance from Napoleon to William happened unambiguously. Post-1830 memoirs can be very misleading on this point and rarely stand up to scrutiny wherever one finds contemporary evidence. Scheltens, for instance, blamed the king in his memoirs for his slow career advancement, but there is no proof that he harbored anti-Dutch feelings in the years 1814, 1815. His former sergeant of the Grenadiers of the Imperial Guard was warmly recommended for a commission as second lieutenant by Belgian and Dutch generals alike, Evers and Tyndall. The letters of Captain Goblet d'Anguilla show us a man with mixed feelings. Before Waterloo, he wrote warmly about the enormously likable Dutch upper-class officers he met. He admitted, however, that though his duty was on the Netherlands side, his heart was elsewhere. This did not stop him one moment longing for the sound of the guns. After the battle, he wrote feelingly about French prisoners of war from his former regiment, but also called the British and the Prussians his comrades. As Mark Wishon has pointed out for the British and the German allies, national differences were shaped or diminished by multinational or transnational elements such as professional or class-based solidarities that would emerge as stronger commonalities than ethnicity. So we can conclude then that the formation of the army in 1814, 1815 was neither listing the attempt nation building nor recovered the means to dominate the South, but instead simply an effort to create a strong army in which the underrepresentation of Belgian officers was less the result of bias than simply the effect of past history and contingency. that the attitudes and choices of officers and men were more the result of material factors or the military ethos of the times than of nationalism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Neffers. I think indeed we've been privileged this morning to hear three angles of formation of identity and development of national spirit due to very different circumstances. But this is a part of what these congresses are about, allowing us to understand and broaden our view due to different points of view and different events. We have a few minutes and I'm opening the floor to questions. Would you please take off your mask, present yourself and ask? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Pasi Tuunainen from Finland. A question or comment to Lasse Laaksonen. Thank you, Lasse. I'm looking forward to reading your next book on General Wallenius. And it's curious, but even today, Finnish army is teaching the courses on Arctic warfare to the representatives of various armies, Canadians, Americans, and British, and whatever, in Lapland, the area that you are talking about. But those are more about survival. They are not about tactics as such, but more about the Arctic survival. Anyhow, I have two comments. The first one about these experiences of these the events from 18 to 20. Based on these experiences, the Finns, when they were planning for the next war, they thought that the Red Army could not operate in the north with large formations because it's trackless area and a difficult area of operation. However, when the Soviet army invaded Finland in late 1939, as in the start of the winter, later to be the Winter War, they advanced along every road, even small road, with substantial numbers and troops, up to divisions. So tens of thousands of soldiers in this area where Finns had a couple of thousand troops against them. Later they had more. So this really tells us that these experiences, they were outdated by then, and there was a huge intelligence failure on the part of the Finns when the Red Army decided to attack in 1939. The next point is that still that you mentioned that the Finnish army could allow the Red Army to advance deep into their territory because it was the size of Belgium, the whole of Lapland, or even bigger. And they managed to stop the Red Army and they with the overextended lines of communication and supply. But would you agree with me that the key to this Finnish defensive success was over snow mobility? And I'm referring to the fact that the Red Army was only road-bound. Motorized troops, not mechanized in many cases, but motorized troops, they could not leave the roads. So they were just attacking along these few roads, and the Finns, ski troopers, they could do whatever they pleased. They could attack and harass and cut the lines of communication and so forth. And by the way, the Finns had developed during the interwar period, they had developed the capability to camp, fight, move outside the road network anywhere. So would you agree with me that, first of all, there was an intelligence failure based, and these experiences were outdated in 39, and then that the over-snow mobility of ski troopers was a key to Finnish successes in the north?
Thank you. Lasse. Press here.
Thank you, Pasi, for your questions and comments. Yes, I agreed. And the funny thing in the Winter War times was that Wallenius was very famous in, if I think, the international press. And he did have his own press events there, and actually Wallenius was well known
better than our supreme commander Mannerheim in Western press. And the journalists, they asked from Wallenius how many men you have in different kind of places, and Wallenius said, "Oh, just some. I know the Russians comes via roads." So he could handle the situation very well, but in the other side, the Red Army, of course, their intelligence was quite poor, and they didn't understand how strong resistance the Finns are in the northern front. But actually the terrain, it was quite many challenges, and the roads were very narrow, and it was easy to control if you know the circumstances and the nature and the art of war in those Arctic circumstances.
Thank you, Lasse. Thank you, Lasse. Yes, please.
Tomáš Jakl, Military History Institute, Prague. I have a question for Professor Laxon as well. You have mentioned the Finnish Legion raised by British from former Finnish Red Army members in the Murmansk area. What was the fate of these soldiers, especially after British withdrawal?
Actually, it was quite cruel. The most of the soldiers they couldn't move back to Finland, and they were Karelians, most of them. And after some years, when Stalin get power, so most of them were executed. And in the Peace of Tartu, the Russian side, the Soviet, they promised to give autonomy to Karelian people. There were quite much communists from Finland, and the promise, they couldn't get any kind of autonomy. They didn't want to have any kind of possibilities for the minorities to live in those countries, because those areas, because the Finns were actually, the whole system were so different. If we think about our parliamentarian democracy, and in the Russian side, the power of Bolsheviks.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, as our time is up, I conclude this session. I want to thank heartily our speakers, the two which are present here, and the speaker who is on his way back home. Please give them a round of applause. Thank you very much indeed. And see you all in the next sessions. All the best. Thank you for your presence. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting indeed about the formation of the entities and fantastic. Thank you.
In fact, I mentioned that they have already published it. I took it to Lviv to obtain an English master in military history. Give it.